This is Christian Book Blurb, brought to you by author and songwriter Matt McChlery. Get a behind-the-scenes glimpse into the lives of some of your favourite Christian authors, hear about their books and faith. Also, why not check out my website, mattmcclery.com. Well, hello and welcome to another edition of the Christian Book Blurb, where we like to encourage you in your discipleship one book at a time, as we meet some amazing Christian authors and learn about their books, their lives, and their faith. Well, I'm your host, Matt McChlery. Thanks for clicking over and joining me today. Now, on today's show, I'm going to be talking about audiobooks and also somebody's own personal experience of living through cancer with the author, Kate Nicholas. So let's welcome Kate to the show. Hi, Kate.
Hi, Matt. It's so good to be here. Thanks very much.
Yeah, thanks for joining me. It's great to have you here. And your book, one of your books, because I know you've got a few, one of your books is called To the Ocean Floor. And it recently won a CRT award. So that stands for Christian Resources Together. And it won that award for the best audiobook in 2024. Now, for those listeners who don't know, CRT is like it's the Christian Book Award that you want to win in the UK. It's like it's the one that counts. So congratulations.
Oh, thank you. I was blown away by it. It was wonderful. Yeah, To the Ocean Floor. It's actually about my second cancer journey during the pandemic and how it became a gateway into a profound connection with God. I wasn't the first time I was diagnosed. I was first diagnosed with stage 4 advanced cancer in 2014 that has spread around my heart and around my mediastinal area around my lungs. And I wasn't expected to survive more than about 12 months. But as I always say, spoiler alert, the fact that I'm here talking to you today shows that God did something amazing. And I went into remission for 7 months. But in the midst of the pandemic, the cancer came back again. And that's what this book is about. It came back with a vengeance. And it's a book about how I connected with God in the stillness at the center of this whole storm I was caught up in. And I think one thing I love is Gerard Kelly, the poet Gerard Kelly said, it's a powerful account of the richness to be found at the borders of life's journey, which I think sums it up rather well.
Mm-hmm. And something I found with it as well is, yes, it doesn't shy away from the experience that you went through. Some of it is quite honest and raw, which is great, because I think, and we might talk about this a bit later, it's important for people to hear stories like this. But it's not just solely that. There's a lot of spiritual journey in there and God at work, even entire whole chapters of just, this is what God's doing, this is what God's saying, this is how I've connected to God in this way or that way. So yeah, it's not just one dimensional, I think is what I'm trying to say. It gives a nicely kind of well-rounded view of your experience from the practical side, but also the spiritual side, which is really good. Audiobook. Let's come back to audiobooks. So this won an audiobook award. Now, what's it like recording an audiobook?
Well, it's great fun. It's slightly bizarre. I spent about 3 days locked in a small padded cell about the size of a telephone box, reading my own book. I actually thought it'd probably be read by an actor or a professional, but my publisher decided they wanted me to do it. I must say I have got a lot of experience working in radio and in television. So I decided that I was going to do this. And I thought it would be, I don't know what I thought it'd be, it was very intense and it was incredibly moving. I was quite surprised by the intensity. There's a scene in it where I'm separated by my husband by COVID rules. And when I read it and came to this, I got quite upset. There was a real catch in my voice. And I immediately said to the producer, sorry, I'll do that again. And he said, no, it's that, as you talked about, that vulnerability, that authenticity that makes it so powerful. And of course, he was absolutely right, which is why I think he got the CRT awards, because I had such great advice doing this.
Mm. And if someone else is probably thinking about maybe recording an audiobook, if there's any authors or budding writers out there, what are some of the things you think they need to know about the audiobook recording process, if they're going to prepare for something like that?
Yeah, well, I think what I would say is that try and write as if you're going to do an audiobook. I've actually now, with the book I'm working on now, which we can talk about later, I am actually, as I write it, I'm reading it out loud. Because one of the first things I discovered when I got into my little telephone box was, of course, that I got so many Greek and Hebrew words in it, and I had to make sure I was absolutely right on the pronunciation. And I had a real problem with the word contemplative, which we're sure we'll talk about is very prominent in the book. And so I kept stumbling over this. So I think really writing a book as if it's going to be read aloud. And I think the second thing is practice, 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 because by the time you get in, you need to be able to pace each scene accordingly. You aren't just reading a book. In a way, you're acting the book, because you need to be able to immerse the reader totally in a way in your story. And so you need to bring the words alive for them. It is a wonderful process, though. I'd really recommend to anyone thinking about it that please do it. It's a fantastic thing to do.
Really good. And audiobooks are growing, aren't they? They're growing
Yeah.
in popularity. They're kind of skyrocketing and shooting through the roof, and in some areas of the market. Why do you think audiobooks are so popular?
Well, they're incredibly accessible, aren't they? So a lot of people could listen to them when they're driving or doing other things, doing the housework. I think I really connected with the power of audiobooks when I was ill, because I reached a point, which I talk about in the book, that I was just unable to read. I just was too ill to read. And that's when I began to listen to audiobooks. And it was an incredibly powerful experience. I was listening to all books about faith. I was listening to some healing scriptures as well. And I think I can't speak about why every single type of audiobook is popular, but I think when it comes to books about faith, about personal faith and about spirituality, I think it's really profound to hear directly from the author. It's as if you're able to inhabit their mind, their world for a while, that you're actually able to experience their faith experience. And that is an incredibly powerful thing. Maybe for people who are seekers, people who haven't yet met Jesus, to be able to hear directly from the author and to be able to inhabit that space where they're meeting with Jesus it's just incredible.
Really good. Some listeners might know that I'm a cancer survivor myself. In some of the early days of the podcast, I was on the other end of the microphone and interviewed about a book that I had written about my experience of surviving stage 4 cancer, different type of cancer to yours. But I must say, reading your book, there were a lot of moments I was nodding my head, going, yes, that's what I felt as well. So it's very poignant and insightful. Do you think it's important to share stories like this?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. And I'm very glad that I'm saying, first of all, praise the Lord that you're here and you've got through cancer as well. Which is,
Thank you.
and I think the fact you shared your story is really powerful. Throughout the Bible, God's people are encouraged and even commanded to share what he's done for them. And it's interesting, when I was first diagnosed with stage 4, and it was breast cancer I was diagnosed with. And can I say one thing? Ladies, if you're offered a mammogram, please go and have one. And gentlemen, if your ladies are, if anyone you know is offered a mammogram, please encourage them, because it saved my life. But when I was first diagnosed, I was given a passage from Psalm 118:17. I will not die, but will live and declare the works of the Lord. And I tell you, I hung on to that passage like a life raft. And I began this whole writing journey because I've started to write down my story for my children. I started to put together photograph albums, but I soon realized that they didn't show anything about how I saw the world, what I believed. So I started to write what I call my soul story, really, my experience of God. And this became my first book, my memoir, Sea Change, which tells the story of my rather unconventional faith journey and my story of healing. And that was actually shortlisted for CRT Christian Biography of the Year. And out of that, my life changed. I started going and talking at churches, at Christian events all over the UK, as far afield as Kenya and Australia. And I then did a show on TBN. I presented a show on TBN called Living a Transformed Life, where I had guests in. And I began to hear all these amazing stories that other people had to tell. And I began to think, and I began to realize, I think all of us have got a soul story. I think a story about that part of us that connects with God. A lot of people think their lives aren't dramatic enough, but I think God can use all the circumstances of our lives. And he wants us to understand that story, because I think then we can see the meaning and purpose in our lives. And I think he wants us to share that story, because people can argue with our theology, but they can't argue with your authentic experience of God.
Mm.
Which is, yeah. And so I wrote this, out of this came a book called Soul Scribe, which is a guide to understanding and sharing your soul story, which takes people through the different chapters of their lives. And it asks questions that all build up into a kind of narrative they can share with family and friends. And I even launched an online course called Write Your Soul Story, which is to help people do as we've done and to share their story. But I think it's so powerful, because for some people, we may be the only Bible they ever read. We may be their introduction to Jesus.
Mm. And for a topic like cancer as well, it's such a taboo topic in society. I mean, some people don't even speak its name. They just call it the big C or something. They don't even want to say the word cancer. And people who are going through it sometimes just completely clam up, or they don't feel able to share what's going on inside them. And then you have everyone else in their lives kind of feeling sort of pushed away or blocked out, because they don't quite know how to deal with it or relate to the person, because they don't really know what the person's going through. And so I think just for those of us who do feel called to share big moments in our lives like this, that call for a lot of vulnerability and openness. And I know some people aren't able to go there, and that's okay. But for those of us who are, it just helps to give a bit of that insight and understanding, and maybe help those, or even relatives of those who might be experiencing similar things, to try and gain a bit of an insight or something to help that time in their lives. So yeah, and as you say as well about sharing faith through it is very important as well. You mentioned that your experience was more like saying, in the book you say that it was more like saying thy will be done, rather than battling cancer.
Yeah.
I know in lots of adverts I find they sort of say, oh, we're going to fight cancer, and we're going to kick cancer where the sun don't shine, and all this kind of stuff. But having been there myself, it doesn't really feel like that. I felt really weak and at the mercy of everything. What are your thoughts on it?
Well, I think that we use this term battling cancer because it gives us a sense of agency in a situation that is basically completely outside of our control.
Where we have none, yeah.
Yeah, I've been a bona fide control freak all my life. And I remember when I first started eating, when I first was diagnosed, I went out and bought a juicer, and I started eating vast quantities of kale. And I remember praying each morning, putting on the armor of God, I put on the belt of truth, that you are Jehovah Rapha, the God who heals. But I think that what I felt was that I was being called to trust in God. Now, I'm very clear in my book, I don't know why some people are healed and some are not. I constantly wonder at the fact that I'm still here. I thank you, Lord, each day. I say, this is the day the Lord has made, and I'll rejoice and be glad in it. And I make very clear in my books that I don't think anyone should fight cancer on a diet of prayer and carrots. I believe that doctors are God's hands and feet. I believe that God's wisdom, that all the wisdom that has created all these great medical breakthroughs comes from God. But I think what I have come to realize is that God's Rapha, or healing, is actually something bigger than maybe even just a cure. And I think that the real healing that I experienced was this extraordinary peace that really did pass all understanding. In Sea Change, my first book, I write about how when I was diagnosed, this extraordinary calm came upon me, to the point where I remember the oncologist kept saying to me, "You do understand the implications of what I'm telling you, don't you, Kate?" And I said, yeah, I do. You're telling me I'm dying. He couldn't quite understand how I could be so calm. But I think this sense of God's presence I felt throughout was almost incandescent. It was as if for a while I was standing on the border between the natural and the supernatural. And I think that sense of his presence, I think that sense of peace, I think is probably his greatest healing. And I think I can say, I think with authenticity, that even if I'd not survived, I think I would still have been healed. If that makes sense.
You know, having been there myself, that's one of the amazing things. It happened to me as well.
Yeah.
I had this immense sense of
Wow.
peace
Yeah.
through the whole thing. I don't think I would have made it without that carrying me through.
I find it quite frightening thinking about how people do deal with this without faith. I think it must be a terrible burden.
Another thing that I found very interesting in your book, To the Ocean Floor, is you said that I think one of the most deeply damaging suggestions is that our survival relates to the depth of our faith. So, how does this statement square up with those parts of scripture that seem to link faith and healing in your experience?
Yeah, this is something I've written out quite a lot, both into The Ocean Floor and my memoir, Sea Change. When I first became ill, I started studying what the Bible had to say about healing. And I realized first of all that it is God's perfect will to heal. In Exodus 15:26, he says, "I am the God who heals. I'm Jehovah Rapha." And of course, there are great examples within Jesus' own healings of where faith did play a part. That wonderful story in Mark 5 where, the woman in the crowd reaches out to touch his cloak and he says to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." And there's also examples of others' faith. That lovely story in Luke 5 where the friends lower their paralyzed friend down through the roof.
Through the roof, yeah.
And Jesus says when he saw their faith, he said to them, "Your sins are forgiven." But they're also examples of where people had little faith or no faith. I'm seeing all the 20 plus mass healings that took place. There's no indication that every single person in that crowd utterly had utter faith. And I think one of my favourite stories is the one about in John 5 about the pagan worshipping lame man at the pool of Bethesda, who, when asked afterwards who healed him, said he didn't know. He hadn't got a clue who Jesus was. And yet Jesus was still able to perform this extraordinary miracle. Yeah, I think it's really human to think that if we only pray a little harder, if we only serve the Lord a little better, that we'll be healed. But that's not how God's grace works. We can't earn healing. And I think if we think we can, I think it's a terrible burden to bear. I think what we are called to do is to surrender to his perfect will and to pray, "Thy will be done," and actually mean it.
Yeah, that's it.
And they make that choice to actually trust that he will do what is right for our life.
Yeah, that's really good. Thank you. And you have a recurring image into the ocean floor that you use that you experienced during your treatment, and it also kind of lends itself to the title of the book. Can you explain what you experienced there and how that sort of impacted you?
Yeah. So it was during my first week of treatment in chemotherapy, I became desperately ill with sepsis. And I think the best thing to do is if I can just read you just this very short passage out of the book.
Yeah, please.
Okay. "Once my husband leaves and I'm taken from A&E, any vestiges of fighting spirit leave my body. I'm vaguely aware of being wheeled down through the labyrinthine corridors of the hospital to the acute medical unit, where I'm placed in an isolation room. As the door closes, I once again descend, down through the waters, away from the light, slowly, gently, until my limbs settle on the distant ocean floor. Swaddled in the stillness of the deep, enveloped in silence, All conscious thought ebbs away on the tide. I bathe in the stillness and silence permeates my soul. Lulled by the invisible rhythm of the depths, time loses its meaning. Dreams meld with reality as I rest on the far sea bed, until gradually, in that liminal space, I begin to sense something other. The numinous, a presence vast and uncontained, indefinable but tangible. An encounter with something endless and eternal there in the pressing water. And together we wait in silence, rocked in the arms of the deep. It's the beginning of what I call my ocean floor experience, which was a vision, a mystical experience of God. And paradoxically, To the Ocean Floor is a book about an experience that goes beyond words, which is quite a challenge as a writer. And it's actually, as I began writing, I found that words began to kind of rearrange themselves in unfamiliar patterns, and at times prose merges into poetry. And when I recovered, I began to explore some of the really early traditions that go right the way back to the dawn of Christianity, which had comparable types of visions, go right the way back to Paul, the Desert Fathers. And I discovered this contemplative tradition, I said it this time,
Well done.
that goes right the way back, and which emphasizes on finding God in silence and solitude. Now, remember, this is in the midst of the pandemic, so I spent a lot of time in isolation. I was isolated in hospital rooms, but also from my family as well. And during that time, I began to explore these traditions, and they really challenged me. I'm a raving extrovert, and suddenly I found I was being called to a more introverted relationship with God. I'm also a rationalist. I'm an ex-current affairs journalist, and this was about a tradition that went beyond reason. And it involved meditation. Now, I was not sure what I thought about that, because I understood I'd spent some time in the East, but I soon realized that actually this form of meditation was very different from something like Buddhism, which is all about kind of negation of self, really. This was more about coming fully into the presence of God. And it was so powerful. And as I began to practice this meditation, I began to find my way back to that intensity of that experience, and was able to sit with him during this and to find that stillness in the center of the storm. It was very powerful.
Thank you. For those listeners who might be facing cancer themselves, or who might be in the midst of treatment, what are some of the things that you might say to them?
Well, first of all, this is not an easy road. Excuse me, saying chemo is pants, there's no doubt about it. But God is much bigger than any challenge we face. And I think sometimes we're in danger of making God too small. He can do more than we can ever imagine. The fact that I'm here today speaking to you is proof of that. In actual fact, Sea Change tells the whole story, but my healing actually began before the treatment started. My cancer began to shrink before the treatment started. And I think his power can be perfect in our weakness. I think some of the most powerful words in the Bible are from Psalm 46:10. Be still and know that I am God. In all his enormity, in all his power. And one of the reasons I wrote To the Ocean Floor is that actually I wanted to help other people do that. And so my book does not only share my own experience of doing that, it shares resources to help others do that as well, whatever trials they're facing.
Really good. And for listeners who have loved ones facing cancer and they're kind of sitting on the other side of the fence, as it were, what would you say to them?
Oh, it's so hard. I often think it's actually harder for loved ones than those who are actually going through treatment themselves. You know yourself, once you get in the system, it's a bit like you're in a sausage machine. You're just going to keep going. But your loved ones left standing on the shore, kind of feeling very helpless. I know my own family suffered a great deal through this. A few years ago, I was actually interviewed by Premier Radio. I remember the presenter saying to me, she said, it's really strange. She said, it's almost as if cancer was a gift. And I thought a lot about that statement since. And of course, I wish I hadn't had cancer. I really wish my family hadn't been through this. But it's hard to wish away everything that came with that, because I think with the awareness of our mortality, sometimes we can become even more aware of our being alive, the vibrancy of being alive, and the sense of God's presence tangible. And I think one of the best things that your loved ones can do is to be aware of that and recognize that within all this pain, there can be real joy in God's presence, and to be aware of that and to help enable that.
Really good. And I know we've been focusing quite a lot on cancer because obviously that's what you wrote your book about.
Yeah.
But I guess some of the stuff that God did and spoke to you can be applied much broader than just to someone with cancer. It can be applied to sort of any big trial or time of suffering, whatever that may look like in somebody's life. So how can we all embrace times of trial and suffering in ways that will lead us to a greater connection with God and a strengthening of faith rather than it being destroyed by it?
Yeah, very good question. There's a writer called Franciscan writer called Richard Rohr. Do you know Richard Rohr? I'm sure a number of people will do. And he writes about something called the two halves of life faith. In the first half of life, we are seeking to find all's control and to understand. And we ask the question, why has this happened? But in our second half of life faith, and this can happen at any stage in your journey, it can happen when you're very young, it's not chronological. We learn to embrace uncertainty and the paradox of life, the paradox of faith, to actually embrace that mystery. And then we begin to ask instead, what is God doing here? And I think our God is one of transformation. We're all on journey as Christians that are about transforming the image of Christ. And I think he uses all the circumstances of our lives to transform us. But I think this process of transformation is sometimes supercharged by the challenges in life. For example, when I became ill, I was charging around the world, getting on and off planes and buses. I was chief communications officer for the charity World Vision International. And when I was brought to a standstill, it was a real shock. But for the first time in my life, I was able to look back and see how God had been at work. And I began to see how he'd used all the circumstances. He'd been there in the mountaintop moments and in the valleys, bringing me slowly back to him after I rejected him as a young woman. Now, I think there's a wonderful word for to wait in the Old Testament, Hebrew word kawa. To wait is to cower, which means to wait in anticipation of what God can do. Now, I don't believe for a moment that God gives us trials. I don't think he gives us cancer, but I think what we can do is we can recognize that he may be using this moment and to cower, to learn to wait and cower and to see what he might be doing there. And I think he can do extraordinary things through that awareness, if we allow ourselves to become aware of that.
Really good. Thank you, Kate. We are talking with the author Kate Nicholas about her book To the Ocean Floor, obviously paperback, but also the audiobook version. We'll be back just after these and we'll be finding out a bit more about Kate's life and faith. So join us after these.
If you enjoy listening to this podcast, you can help keep it on the web. All you've got to do is buy me a coffee. Head over to buymeacoffee.com/Matt McChlery to make a donation. There is a link in this episode's show notes. So go on, buy me a coffee today and help this podcast to keep supporting Christian books and authors.
Hello, welcome back to the Christian Book Blurb. We've been chatting with author Kate Nicholas about her book To the Ocean Floor that recently won a CRT award for Best Audiobook. Now, Kate, what we like to do after the interval is get to know the author a little bit better, although we've got to know you quite well already because your writing and your book and everything sort of has told us a lot about you already. But here's a good one for you. What do you like to do for fun?
Well, I love traveling. I spent a lot of my life traveling. I met my husband when spending 2.5 years traveling in Asia and in Australia. He's an Australian Lithuanian who I met when I was working at UNICEF in Sydney. I thought I was going to live on Bondi Beach, but I married an Australian who wanted to live here. So I now live near Milton Keynes. But I also love being on the water. Water has been a theme throughout my life. I will get into and get onto any body of water. I love wild swimming. But mainly my husband and I are mad on paddleboarding. Neither of us can surf because our
Yes.
knees are shot. But we love paddleboarding. And we've paddleboarded all over the world. We recently spent time off the coast of Wales in the open sea. And I can now navigate a 1 metre wave without falling off, which I'm rather
Wow, well
proud of.
done.
But it is quite athletic, but it's also very reflective. There's something about being out on the open water, and actually something about the sea and about something about kind of the horizon and what it says about this idea of God's eternal promise, and something about the waves and about what they say about the tides of life, really, I suppose. So I love being on water. But I do. I'm also a preacher. I'm a lay minister at the Church of St Peter and St Paul Noni, where Amazing Grace was written. So I'm on the ministry team there. And the other things I do is I'm a trustee on the board of Christians Against Poverty, which is incredibly important to me.
Oh, that's great. And have you got any favorite things to eat or maybe watch on the telly or anything like that? Any particular favorites at the moment?
Well, I don't have a hugely sweet tooth, thank goodness, because sugar isn't meant to be very good for cancer. But I do love coffee. I got very addicted to it when working in a newsroom. I got rather addicted to it because we have free espressos available. When I gave it up, I discovered that I was actually addicted. So I now drink decaf. But in terms of things that I would love to watch on television, I love to watch Brian Cox on BBC. There's something about, I'm very interested in cosmology and evolutionary biology. I think there's something about the sheer wonder of God's creation. I love the fact that the world is far more mysterious than we could ever begin to imagine. And I'm very interested, although I'm not an expert on things like quantum physics, because I think the deeper we get into science, the more mysterious our world becomes and the closer we seem to come to God.
Yeah, really interesting. Really good. So one of my questions was going to be, do you prefer tea or coffee? Well, I think you've already answered that one quite conclusively. We've just had Christmas. And so with your Christmas traditions and all that sort of thing, is it a traditional Christmas roast with Christmas pudding, or is it something more, I don't know, modern or contemporary? Or I know some in my family hate Christmas pudding, so we have to provide an alternative for them. What's your take on sort of traditional Christmas food?
Well, we have a rather different Christmas tradition because my husband, to say, his family were Lithuanian refugees following the Second World War to Australia.
Yes,
and they
of
brought with
course.
them a wonderful tradition called kuchas, which is on Christmas Eve, we have an amazing meal made up of 12 dishes, mainly made up of herring. You've got to like herring if you're married to a Lithuanian. And so we celebrate on Christmas Eve as a family. It's a beautiful tradition with a lot of rituals attached to it, rather like a Seder meal, really. And then we have my version on Christmas Day. We have the English version on Christmas Day, which involves a goose, actually. We prefer goose to turkey.
So that's a lot of eating there.
That is a lot of eating. I usually go on a diet around about Boxing Day.
Yeah, I don't blame you. Really good. We've been speaking about sort of some fun things. Well, I suppose this is still fun, but it's more from like the sublime to the ridiculous, or the ridiculous to the sublime. I'm getting my words all in a muddle today. Never mind. So, on a bit more of a serious note, what is the Holy Spirit doing or saying in your life at the moment?
Well, since my ocean floor experience, I've spent a lot more time in silence, in meditation. I still very much involved in my church. It's so important to be part of the church family. But I found that this contemplative tradition and spending time in meditating in silence is become a very important part of my life. And interestingly, I found that it's changed the way that I see the world. Even back when I was in hospital, I began to become much more aware of Christ around me. I write about that a lot in the book. In fact, I dedicated the book to the wonderful staff of the NHS, I think, through whom I saw Christ's compassion on many occasions. But also in nature, I found a very interesting Celtic Christianity, which is about being more aware that in him we live and move and have our being. And I love walking out in nature and just being aware. I find the Holy Spirit is just making me much more aware of this idea of existing within God's Spirit and being imbued with God's Spirit. It's very powerful. And so this whole, I think some people might think meditation is a bit self-indulgent. I don't think it is at all. I think it changes the way we see the world, makes us more aware of God within, God around, but also God in others.
Have you got anything coming up soon? I know you dropped a subtle hint earlier on. What's coming up from Kate Nicholas?
Well, it's not going to come out till spring 2026, but I'm currently working on my next book. I've just I'm about a third of the way through writing it, and it's called Seeking Amazing Grace, Following in the Footsteps of John Newton. And it's not another book about John Newton's history. It's another journey. I think the best way to put it is Bill Bryson plus God.
So interesting. Yeah, okay.
So that's coming out in spring 2026.
Oh, we look forward to that. And where can we find you on social media or websites? Where can we find the audiobook as well as your physical books? How can we get more into your writing?
Brilliant. Well, yeah, I'm on social media. I've got a Facebook author page. I'm Kate Nicholas Author. Instagram, Kate Nicholas, and I'm also on TikTok, Kate Nicholas Writes. You can get my books at any Christian bookstore, but also online at Amazon, Waterstones, Eden, Aslan, any online retailer. And as you say, they're available in paperback, Kindle, and To the Ocean Floor is available as an audiobook on Audible and other audio channels. But also, to make that simple, if you go to my website, katenicholas.co.uk, has all the links to everything. And it has information about my books. You can watch my television series with TBN, Living a Transformed Life. And it's also got my course on there, Write Your Soul Story.
Well, thank you, Kate. It's been a joy chatting with you today and learning so much about you and your books.
Well, thank you, Matt.
And thank you as well for listening to this episode of the Christian Book Blurb. Don't forget, we come out twice a month. Oh, it's still early in the new year. I need to get my head around this. We come out twice a month on the 1st and the 15th of the month. So I will be back really soon speaking with another fantastic Christian author all about their books, their lives, and their faith. Thank you so much. I'll see you in a few weeks' time. Goodbye.
Thanks for listening to Christian Book Blurb with your host, Matt McChlery. Do give it a like, give it a share, and let your friends know all about it. We do hope to see you again soon on another Christian Book Blurb.